In 1976, Cadillac released the last American convertible, the top-of-the-line Fleetwood Eldorado, the only soft-top car being made in the United States at that time. In a way, its release signalled the end of the great American romance with the motor car, and it also indicated that the manufacturers had come to terms with the fact that they must change. No more were acres of steel and litres of engine to be the important characteristics of a car. If the power race was the hallmark of the 1960s, then Ralph Nader's stirrings of consumerism were to be a hallmark of the 1970s. By then, both the public and the car manufacturers had realised that they would have to completely rethink their ideas on the motor car and what it was to be allowed to do. The power race reached its peak at the turn of the decade. In Australia, for example, the big two, Ford and General Motors, were locked in a battle that was typical of what was happening right around the world. There, the focus was on the Bathurst 500, Australia's premier motor race. In 1969, a Holden Monaro like this took first place with a massive 327 cubic inch V8. So Ford went even bigger in 1970 and won with a 351 cubic inch engine. Few paid any attention to what that sort of power was going to mean environmentally or from a safety point of view on the roads. All everyone was interested in was winning. The result was that they were, both of them, incredible cars to drive, provided that all the circumstances were right, which means, of course, only on a racetrack. The problem here, of course, was that large and or highly developed engines were not being confined to the racetracks, and it didn't matter much whether they came from America, who made very big, powerful engines, or Europe, who made small but equally powerful engines, because each of them, each type of engine, was using up natural resources like it was going out of style, and they were essentially unclean. And, of course, most of the power was unusable. Despite that, motorists were still being convinced that the sporting side of motoring, the fun side of motoring, was all important. Two influences were brought to bear on the motoring world in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which ultimately would have a great deal of effect upon what people considered that the car should be. And the first of those influences was legislation. Government authorities all around the world were becoming increasingly alarmed by two problems directly caused by the motor car. Problem number one was that we were killing ourselves in ever-increasing numbers. As we know, Nader set the ball rolling on safety legislation, particularly in the area of primary safety. That is, improving the control of cars so they won't crash in the first place. In the early 70s, legislators were beginning to look at secondary safety, which till then had been almost the exclusive province of some of the smaller European manufacturers. For most people, the brand names that best represent secondary safety and therefore occupant protection are Mercedes, Volvo and Saab, because those three companies have spent a great deal more money advertising their products as being safe than most other companies have. And maybe they are and maybe they aren't, but that's really not what we're here to discuss at the moment. We're concerned with the function of secondary safety as an exercise, and this particular vehicle, a Saab Cutaway, represents secondary safety very well. Let's face it, this is the area which is the most important structural member of the car, because it's inside there that you and your passengers will sit, and that's the area that we need to protect. And we protect that area by building in progressive crumple rates That is an area which will decelerate slowly rather than rapidly and absorb some of the impact of the collision. We do it by structural rigidity in this area. Look at this A-pillar starting right down here, deep, running all the way through to the back of the car. And we do it by building in door bars, for example, which a lot of cars these days still don't have. Bars in the side of the door which help to protect the occupants in the case of a side impact situation. And then we add a few more little features like a steering column, which is impossible for you to be injured by because it's got a universal joint that will simply break off on impact. That's what occupant protection and therefore secondary safety is really all about. Increasingly, those sort of concepts were being legislated into cars. But there was a far broader problem for the legislators than that of car owners and passengers slaughtering each other. They were also having a detrimental effect on everyone else. All those engines of which the makers were so proud were pumping out every kind of filth, wrecking the atmosphere and threatening permanent harm to us all. In the 70s, we saw a great spate of legislation designed to control the noxious emissions of vehicle engines. The point is, it is possible to build a clean engine, but even now, not very many people do it. The Saab people had to do very little with this engine to get it to conform to most of the world's standards for pollution control. And yet, when that sort of legislation was introduced, the world's car manufacturers had a major problem on their hands. They had to make a decision. Would they design a completely new, efficient, clean engine, or would they play with their existing engines and try to get them to the standard of cleanliness required? Of course, they elected to take the cheap way out. They added bolt-on bits of equipment that was supposed to make the engine efficient, which did make it clean, but which overall reduced its efficiency substantially and increased costs for the operator. It simply meant it used a great deal more fuel. And because there were so many more intricate, complex pieces to play with, it also meant that it got out of tune more easily, meaning eventually not only more fuel, but back to the problem of pollution once again. So, the first of the two major influences of the 70s, safety and pollution legislation, was ultimately to mean better and smaller engines powering much more carefully thought out cars. And just as the world was beginning to think in terms of smaller engines and better cars, it was invaded by the second major influence of the decade, Japan. Before the Second World War, the Japanese auto industry was pretty much of a non-event. In fact, they had been building, or at least assembling, cars since, well, almost since the car was conceived in Japan, but since they had no market, there wasn't much point in pushing it too hard. By the mid-1930s, however, there were some attempts being made to get into mass production, and one of the first of these was Datsun, a name which was taken from the first letters of the surnames of the three founders of the organisation, that is, Den, Aoyama and Takeuchi. DAT with son for son of at the end. The first sons of those three people, their first cars in fact, looked so much like the Austin 7s of the day that Herbert Austin was caused to take a look at the possibilities of patent infringement proceedings. He decided, however, that probably nothing much would come of it. Famous last thoughts. After the war, and following a period in which the Japanese industry was held back somewhat artificially by the requirements of the occupational forces, the auto manufacturing industry took off like a rocket, with Datsun, Toyota, Isuzu, Mazda, and Mitsubishi with their Bullet, all vying not only for a slice of the domestic market, but for the whole world scene. In the mid-60s, Toyota decided that the time had come to take on the world, and began by exporting to the United States their large car, the Crown, and a smaller car, the Corona. The Crown was unsuccessful in America because with it the Japanese were attacking the Americans in their own specialist market, large cars. But the Corona was a different story altogether. Small, compact in fact, not unattractive looking, and as a package, just providing everything that American drivers needed at that particular time as it stands. The Corona offered all of the normal comfort options as standard equipment back in 1967, and that had a great deal of appeal because people didn't have to pay extra money for them. The radio, the heated emister and things of that nature were all built in. Up until the time the Corona was released, the Americans particularly had very little choice in the small car range, and the Volkswagen was by far their biggest seller.
Now, the Volkswagen for Americans was a bit of a departure from what they were used to. Rear-engined, air-cooled, strange independent swing axle suspension. So when the Corona came on the market, it looked and felt exactly like a scaled-down American car. The same sort of package, with a column shift or a two-speed automatic. It was something with which they were familiar and could relate to, and it sold very well. Eventually, it was second only to Volkswagen on the small car market, and ultimately, Toyota's other small car, the Corolla, became the world's biggest selling individual model of any type in the early 1970s.
At about the same time, Nissan-Datsun decided that some form of international motorsport would be good for sales, and decided to go rallying with immediate and formidable success. Since that time, one or other of their models has won just about every major rally in the world, including the East African Safari, the Monte Carlo Rally, and the Southern Cross Rally.
On the other hand, the world's largest manufacturer of motorcycles did not need to go rallying to introduce their range of cars. But they did go Formula One Grand Prix racing, which gave the lead to a series of small sports cars, followed by some very tiny toy saloon cars, all designated Z in one form or another, and which finally ended up with the Honda Civic and the Honda Accord. Both were good cars in their own right, but they had one very special feature, something that was not fitted to anything else at that particular time. The CVCC engine. CVCC standing for Compound Vortex Controlled Combustion. Arguably the cleanest production engine in the world, and one which needs no bits hanging off it to keep it that way. In view of all that effort, I guess it's not surprising that the Japanese manufacturers took a great slice of the world's car market, and in fact that Toyota and Nissan now rank third and fourth among car makers of the world. And they did it by providing cars which were small, compact, well-engineered, carefully put together, not wildly powerful, but providing all those features that other car manufacturers insisted on providing as options. In view of that sort of pressure, and of the current trends towards legislation, it's not the least surprising that today's manufacturers are starting to think along Japanese concepts.
It wasn't long before the Japanese began to threaten major manufacturers in the middle and large car markets as well. But their most effective thrust, the thrust that was to provide the only really new motoring concept of the 70s, was into recreational vehicles, specifically off-road four-wheel drive vehicles, a market held traditionally by Jeep and Land Rover. The Japanese swept in to match those two, and then downscaled into what might almost be described as toy cars. Cars like this Suzuki, which were cheap enough and practical enough for small farmers, but which more specifically provided all the fun and excitement that you could no longer find on the roads. Ultimately, in their turn, off-road recreational vehicles came under legislators' scrutiny too, which was fair enough. Indiscriminate destruction of the environment should always be discouraged, be it noise, smoke, or just bush bashing. The concept of recreational vehicles took off like a rocket, and not just for off-roading. Volkswagen, for one, recognised the potential of their Combi to be something more than just a hack delivery van. Suddenly you could grab the kids and the dog and take off on a holiday for a weekend, a week, a month, or a year, with all mod cons, a refrigerator and a stove and plenty of cupboards and beds for 4 people. Not very comfortable beds, but quite reasonable for the sort of time you'd be away and for the purposes that you wanted them for. The early Volkswagen campers were not particularly good on the road. They were a bit unstable and they didn't have much power, but subsequently they replaced the engine with one of 2,000 cc's capacity and they revised the suspension, and suddenly they became quite reasonable. The recreational vehicle became the sports car of the 70s, and it's not surprising that it did when you consider what was happening to the so-called sports car. And if you need an example of that, this MGB is a very good one. Our old friend, the MGTC, eventually graduated to become the TD and then the TF, which was probably the last of the true MG sports cars in the classic tradition of MGs, because the car that followed was the MGA, in which all that sort of square-rigged, fashionable MG appearance disappeared and the car became a smooth-flowing, more aerodynamically effective car. The MGA became the MGB, and by the standards of most of the cars of the day, the MGB was boring when it was first released. After it had been on the market for some 15 years, it was boring, boring, boring. And it remains so. The word sports doesn't work for MGs anymore. In fact, they could very effectively drop the word fast from their slogan, safety fast. When you finish up with a car which gets quite literally blown into the weeds by things like Mini Coopers and Lotus Cortinas, which are sedan cars, then it's not surprising that one tends to stop thinking about the MGB as being a sports car, and it probably becomes something like an undergrown 2-seater convertible. It's a very pleasant convertible. This is the sort of day on which to drive it. It's sunny, it's lovely with the hood down, but it's not a fast car, and it never will be a fast car, and it just motors along quite sedately, and you can't stir it up because it doesn't want to be stirred. No one would deny that there were better sports cars around in the 70s than the MGB, but they all had problems. They were
too expensive, or they were too luxurious to be real sports cars, or they were too mass-produced. They'd sort of lost all of their individuality. And then I must immediately retract that in the case of just two names. First of which is Lotus. Lotus is the name of the marque of cars created by Colin Chapman. And Colin Chapman is probably the only truly individualistic car designer constructor of this modern era, a constructor in the traditions of Bugatti and Bentley, people like that. Fame came to Colin Chapman with one particular car, the Lotus 18. And this particular 18 was probably the most famous of all. This is the car privately owned and entered by Rob Walker for Sterling Moss. With it, Moss set the Grand Prix circuit alight, surprising everyone, and not the least the other race car makers, with a series of unexpected Grand Prix wins. The 18 was not an easy car to drive, and it took drivers of the calibre of Moss, and then later Jim Clark, to get the most from them in those days. They were super light and very sensitive and high-spirited, a feature passed on by Chapman into many of his road cars as well. The 18 was Chapman's first Formula One Grand Prix racing car, and it was immediately successful, but it followed a line of cars which had begun when Chapman built a car for his own particular purposes, and he was a very successful, energetic and very quick racing driver in his day. But he was about to become a more successful constructor because, having built a few cars for himself, his friends and acquaintances demanded replicas. And he said, all right, well, I'll build you one, and then another one, and then another one, and Lotus became an industry. And by the mid-1960s, 1966 in fact, by the time the Europa was released, it was a highly successful marketing and selling operation. Innovative, different, changeable, as Chapman was himself, and exciting in every sense of the word. And despite a few failures, like the Elite, which was not a particularly good car in anybody's language, Chapman has gone on from success to success in terms of building private road cars, but obviously from the Grand Prix point of view as well, as witness the 1978 win in the World Championship Grand Prix Series by Mario Andretti. There are critics of Chapman, of course, and they say that his cars are somewhat over-engineered and maybe underbuilt, slightly too light and fragile, which is Chapman's real point of view expressed in metal and engineering, that is lightness. And the most recent of Chapman's contributions to the industry have been less than individualistic. That is, they're losing their personality somewhat, which is a great pity. Just one car remaining to grab the title of the true sports car, and for as long as it remains as it is, it will hold that title probably forever. And that car, of course, is the hopeless, harsh-riding, old-fashioned and peerlessly magnificent Morgan. How anyone could fall in love with a Morgan is hard to understand. In reality, they don't have much going for them. They are the most uncomfortable cars, harsh riding, bouncy, skipping along from ripple to ripple. That people do love them, however, is evidenced by the fact that you have to wait 4 years to own a new one. I can't even tell you why, but I'd gladly join the queue. It has to do with style and personality and a little nostalgia. If nothing else, the Morgan has all of that. an incredible car. Makes you want to talk with a limp. I wonder how long the Morgan can last out against the rest of the world. I hope it's forever, but somehow I doubt it. The legislators will get at it eventually, or perhaps just the harsh economic realities of our world, or maybe just the fact that it's not very nice being on the roads anymore, and in a convertible, which guarantees you a lung full of smog or a slashed and stolen tonneau cover, be it in a Morgan or a Cadillac Eldorado convertible.
And that's why this car represents not just the end of an era, but the end of a dream. And a dream not just about motoring, but about what the good life really consists of. A dream that had virility and sex appeal and superficial style as its symbols. A dream that ultimately we could not afford.